Hello and welcome. I'm Anand Naidu, filling in for Riz Khan. When it comes to Afghanistan, many questions are being raised about the future United States military role in that country. At the heart of the current debate is a request by the top U.S. commander in Afghanistan for more than 40,000 additional troops. With an apparent split between his military and civilian advisors, U.S. President Barack Obama is said to be looking for a third way, one that takes a more middle-of-the-road approach. But there is no talk of any withdrawal. Last week, Matthew Hoh, a senior U.S. civilian representative in Afghanistan, quit his post, saying he no longer saw any value in continued U.S. involvement in what he described as a 35-year-old civil war. On today's show, we ask, is it time for the U.S. to withdraw from Afghanistan? And what would that mean for U.S. security and for the Afghan people? A reminder, you can join the conversation with your questions and comments. You can send an SMS or email, and we also welcome your phone calls on the show. Joining me now is Matthew Hoh, a former Marine Corps captain. Mr. Hoh served at the Pentagon and saw combat in Iraq. As a civilian, he managed reconstruction projects in Iraq before joining the State Department and being sent to Afghanistan's Zabul province. Matthew, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Let us start with your resignation. Now, when you resigned, that certainly caused a lot of waves, if not just in Washington, but in other places as well. You sent a letter to your employee, the State Department, and in that letter you said you had lost understanding of and confidence in the strategic purposes of the United States presence in Afghanistan. I'm wondering if you could explain that. What did you believe the U.S. was there for in the first place, and what do you believe is going wrong?
Sure. I believe the United States went there in 2001, as we rightly should, to destroy al-Qaeda and to dismantle the Taliban regime because it allowed for those attacks to have taken place and was providing shelter to the al-Qaeda organization. Since 2001, we have done that. We have chased al-Qaeda and the Taliban regime out of the country. However, I think what's happened over the last few years is we have just basically gotten into an annual process of renewing our commitment in Afghanistan without actually really thinking about what we're doing there. I've come to believe, and I think a lot of my colleagues believe as well, that our presence in Afghanistan only fuels the insurgency there, and it's insurgency that's based now upon the fact that people are occupied as opposed to having any type of ideological ties or any type of with the Taliban or with al-Qaeda or any hatred of the West.
So you're saying that the fighting is going on merely because the United States is there?
The fighting is going on, I believe the fighting is going on because it's a 35-year-old civil war, and we've taken one side in that's 35-year-old civil war. I believe that we are backing a central government that is not wanted or respected in large parts of the country, and that's the focus of that civil war.
Now, when you went to Afghanistan, you had a role to play over there. When did you start having these reservations about what the United States was doing there?
Sure. Before I went, I read as much Afghan history as I could, particularly late 70s and the Soviet-Afghan War. I have plenty of friends and colleagues who had both in the military and in civilian capacity served in Afghanistan. And so some things didn't make sense to me. However, once I got there, it was really a culminating series of events, both from my time in the eastern part of the country bordering Pakistan and the southern part of the country, which also borders Pakistan. And it was really a series of events, as well as a series of continual conversations I had with not just my American and NATO colleagues, but more importantly, my Afghan colleagues, as well as many of the Afghan citizens that I dealt with on a constant basis.
Now, critics would say, look, you spent a relatively short period in Afghanistan, 5 months, and you were in the Foreign Service in the State Department also for a very short period of time. So what makes you the expert?
Sure. I've spent 12 years in service in my country, 6 of those overseas. This is what I've done for my career, has been warfare and counterinsurgency and governance and reconstruction. I don't believe staying there for any longer period of time would have made any change, would have made anything different. Once I hit a point in my conscience where I said, our troops are dying for a cause that does not defeat al-Qaeda and that does not stabilize the Pakistani government, which I believe are the two goals we should have, then I felt there was no way I could no longer serve with a good conscience.
Now, there's something else which is not widely reported. In your letter to your bosses, you also said that you had come to the conclusion after the August election that Afghanistan is effectively two societies. One, urban, educated, modern and secular, and the other, rural, religious, illiterate and traditional. These two societies don't exist in harmony. In fact, they exist fighting each other. They exist in a state of tension. And is the United States seeing as propping up one or the other?
Yes, yes. That's one of the fundamental parts of my beliefs of what's happening there is the U.S. is backing that urban, educated, secular side against the rural, the traditional, the religious, the poor. And I believe we're filling the same role that the Soviets filled in the 80s when they are involved in that war there. And this is, again, this is a civil war that really, to me, began in the mid-'70s after the overthrow of the king.
Now, the support that the Taliban gets in Afghanistan, are they getting it from the rural Afghanistan?
Yes. Yes, that's my belief. And when we say Taliban, we have to be careful what we say. And that's another issue for me as well, is whenever I would see a media report referencing one of our young men or women who were killed in Afghanistan, it would invariably say they were killed by the Taliban, and Taliban would be spelled with a capital T. So the reference would immediately make people think that these are the same people who were, while the Taliban wasn't involved in 9/11, people would believe that these are the same people who were somehow implicated in the 9/11 attacks, when that's not the case. The reality is the people we're fighting are people who just don't want to be occupied, whether it's by a foreign power such as ourselves or our NATO allies, or by a central government that does not represent them. The Taliban itself, or the Taliban with a capital T, as everyone likes to say now, the guys who were in Quetta, that remnant of that Taliban regime that we destroyed in 2001, Mullah Omar and his ilk, I believe they probably have a few thousand hardcore followers, but the bulk of the people, as I said, they're funded by the guys out of Quetta. However, they're not ideologically allied with them. They share no common interests with them. They don't hate the West, so to say. They just don't want to be occupied.
Now, when you submitted your resignation, there was an attempt to retain you. They
Yes.
didn't want you to leave, right?
Yes.
Who wanted you to stay there?
Both Ambassador Eikenberry, who is the U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan, as well as Ambassador Holbrooke, who is the special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan affairs for the United States.
Were they offering you another position?
Yes.
Now, one of the things that Richard Holbrooke, as you mentioned, the special envoy, said in offering you that position, he said that you could achieve a lot more by being inside the building than outside the building. Didn't he have a point there?
A couple things, and I actually did. I accepted his offer for about a week, and it just didn't sit right with me. I felt I wasn't being honest to my convictions after being there for 5 months in Afghanistan and reporting this type of information for 5 months, and really seeing that nothing was going to change. I felt I had to be honest with the original intent of my resignation. The other part, too, is that I believe the administration more or less has probably made up its mind already on where it's going to go with Afghanistan. And if I don't believe that, I can't serve that. And finally, if I believed in the mission, I would have stayed working in Zabul, where I was a political advisor to an Afghan governor, and which was the second best job I ever had in my life.
We've got a caller on the line. This is Reginald calling us from Fiji. Reginald, go ahead with your question.
Yes, thank you. I was just thinking, with President Obama being a new president, one would have thought that he would have gone for ideology rather than shooting it out, because they have military might. Now, they seem to be South America, Vietnam, you name it. There's enough memory to say that Americans are unsuccessful everywhere they go.
What is your question, Reginald?
They don't understand the tradition of the countries. Thank you.
Okay, he was just making an observation there, saying that he would have expected a more ideological outcome
Sure.
in Afghanistan rather than military means. Let me ask you this. If you were in a position to advise the president directly right now, what would be your advice to him?
What I would say is this, Mr. President, we are involved in one side of a civil war. Civil wars only end by one side defeating or decimating the other, by both sides becoming tired of the conflict and segregating themselves from one another, or by political reconciliation. If we're honest in our views that we want a stable Afghan government, then we need to force political reconciliation. I don't believe the Karzai regime has any intention or desire to reconcile politically with its opponents. Secondly, I would urge him, Mr. President, our troops are dying because we're fighting people who don't want our presence there, and that's the only reason why. Stop combat operations in valleys and villages where they're only fighting us because we're occupying them. And finally, I would say, Mr. President, there's 60,000 troops in Afghanistan is not going to defeat or destroy al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is a worldwide organization that has very little representation in terms of its operatives from Afghans or Pakistanis, and that we need to address al-Qaeda via a different mechanism. And one thing I want your viewers to be clear about is that by no means am I saying that al-Qaeda is not a dangerous group. By no means I'm saying al-Qaeda is not a threat. I'm saying al-Qaeda is the threat, al-Qaeda is the priority, and we need to attack and destroy al-Qaeda rather than occupy Afghanistan.
But, you know, when one mentions Afghanistan, it triggers a certain kind of reaction, especially here in the United States, because of the events of 9/11. I mean, people would say, look, the United States got involved in there in the first place because of what happened on 9/11. The Bush administration was fond of saying, look, we've got to do that there so that it doesn't happen here. We have to fight the enemy over there so we don't have to fight the enemy over here. I'm sure you can understand then where those people are coming from and where those emotions are what they're generating.
Yes, I do. And you know, 9/11 was a very traumatic event for the United States, a traumatic event for the world. We have an obligation to prevent another 9/11. You know, al-Qaeda is not an existential threat to the United States in the sense that they can destroy our way of life. They can only destroy our way of life if we allow them to, and lots of people have said that, most famously Colin Powell. However, we can't allow another 9/11 because the financial consequences that would happen on the world markets if something like that happened again, as well as just prevent loss of life, which you know, any good government wants to do. But going back to it, it's 8 years removed. Al-Qaeda's changed, they've evolved. They're not going to tie themselves to a geographical or political boundary anymore. And so keeping troops in Afghanistan is not going to prevent another 9/11. Well, just this past week in Pakistan, they found those passports for those two supposed al-Qaeda operatives. The one man was either just an associate of Muhammad Atta or was actually the chief logistician for the Hamburg cell that carried out the 9/11 attacks. This was a guy he was a German, and he had never been to Pakistan or Afghanistan prior to 9/11. He went to Pakistan actually just a week before 9/11 occurred. So we have to understand that there's no geographical or political boundary ties to al-Qaeda. They exist worldwide, and we have to attack them that way. 60,000 troops in Afghanistan is not going to defeat al-Qaeda.
Okay, Matthew, lots more to talk about. We're getting a lot of emails on this subject, but right now we are going to have to take a short break. More of our discussion in a moment. Stay with us. We'll be right back.